So this video is based on a recent article from the Times about the guidance for schools regarding transgender. It's my views, and then I'm also including the views of 3 blokes on GB News. Their views too. So it starts with tougher transgender guidance for schools is unlawful, Sunak is told. Kind of concerning. So Rishi Sunak is expected to delay issuing transgender guidance for schools after the Attorney General and government lawyers warned that plans to strengthen it would be unlawful. A Whitehall source said that Number 10 and Kemi Badenoch, the Women and Equalities Minister, wanted the guidance to be hardened amid pressures from Tory MPs. The draft guidance stated that children should be allowed to socially transition with the consent of their parents, meaning that they could choose another pronoun or name and wear the uniform of the opposite sex. Clearly, they haven't been listening to the Cass report or paying any attention to the reports by Miriam Cates or anything else. This is my interjection. I'll carry on with the article. But the government then commissioned legal advice from Victoria Prentice, the Attorney General, about whether a ban on social transitioning in schools was possible. Last week, she concluded that such a move would be unlawful and said that the government would need to pass new legislation if it wanted to go further. So this is the problem that we currently have with the Equality Act. It's an absolutely pants piece of legislation, along with the GRA. Nobody understands what the law actually is in terms of sex and gender. So I think, quite honestly, we need to push for a new law. Repeal the old ones. Let's put something in place that's actually understandable for everyone. Sunak had committed himself to publishing the guidance by the end of this week, but the Times has been told that it's unlikely given the Attorney General's advice. Personally, I would rather a delay and we get new laws than a rush through and some pathetic attempt to try and just smooth over what the current issues are. It's been going on too long now. The Prime Minister is concerned about the long-term implications of allowing children to socially transition, quite rightly. A government source said, "We have consistently said that this is about protecting children, empowering parents and supporting teachers and school leaders by providing guidance for them to implement. It's a complex and sensitive area, and it's right we get it right. More information is needed about the long-term implications of allowing a child to act as though they are the opposite sex and the impact that may have on other children too." A Whitehall source said that Number 10 and Badenoch had put forward a series of proposals to strengthen the guidance. The strongest, and a reflection of the government's concerns, was a blanket ban on social transitioning. Social transitioning describes the process by which children who are identified as transgender, it says here transgender children, well, we know that's just a nonsense, or adults adopt a name, pronouns, and gender expression, which again is just a belief system not based in fact and has no business being in schools. Things such as clothing and haircuts that they deem to match their new gender identity, or cult-like religion. Prentice said that a blanket ban would be unlawful because the Equality Act states that gender reassignment is a protected characteristic, regardless of age. And within the Equality Act, just to clarify here, it doesn't actually give a definition of what gender reassignment is, what it entails, what transgender is. So anyone can just say, I'm transgender, I want to change my name and pronouns. There is no guidance. It's basically we have self-ID already because of the current legislation. She gave the same advice when ministers asked whether there could be a ban on social transitioning for primary school children, So we're talking about little babies here who have no idea about their sexuality or what it means to be a man or a woman. Kemi Badenoch has suggested mandatory medical consultation before children are allowed to socially transition. Personally, I couldn't care less. It's had medical consultation. We know how captured the current ex-GIDs and other professionals are within counselling and therapy. Badenoch also wanted to include greater protection for free speech in the guidance, stating explicitly that teachers must not be compelled to address children by their chosen pronoun if they had a good faith objection. In other words, if they have gender critical beliefs. Reality. They believe in reality. The Attorney General and government lawyers advised ministers to caveat the guidance and state that nobody should be compelled unless there was a particular justification for doing so. Ministers have raised concerns that the approach could give schools grounds to discipline teachers if they fail to respect a child's chosen gender. This is the crazy world that we live in now. Badenoch also suggested that doctors must be consulted before allowing children to socially transition as part of a clinical gateway. Again, the Attorney General suggested that the guidance would need to say that they should be consulted. The Department for Health said that the NHS would not be able to provide enough doctors and clinical support to advise on whether children should be able to socially transition. Well, they don't need to provide anyone. We all know that they shouldn't be. So to go further, the government has to change the law. The Attorney General said that if the government wanted to go further on trans guidance for schools, it would need to consider putting it on a statutory footing. Prentice herself is said to favour taking a tougher approach on the guidance. A Whitehall source has told the Times, the government wants to go further, but the problem is that this is guidance. It is coming up against the Equalities Act, which is the law. If the government wants to go further, it has to change the law. There have been claims of differences of opinion between Gillian Keegan, the pathetic excuse of an education secretary. That doesn't say that, I've added that in there. And Badenoch. Keegan has emphasised the importance of trans rights and said that it would be unreasonable to stop children from socially transitioning. She doesn't have children. She doesn't know anything about children. She hasn't got a clue about child development. Why she's in charge of education, nobody knows. She thinks it's fine as long as there's parental consent. Badenoch has repeatedly advocated a tougher approach and has called for the guidance to be robust. Keegan told the Times last month, it's a tricky subject, but I think parental consent is a key driver for this. Schools aren't there as doctors or parents. They are there as educators. Parental consent is the most important thing. Parents are responsible for their child. Some Tory MPs have raised concerns about the guidance. Miriam Cates, the Tory MP for Penistone and Stocksbridge, recently said that the guidance risks becoming an unethical population-level social experiment. And we'll cheer on Miriam Cates because she's the only one that seems to know what reality is currently in the government. A spokeswoman for the Attorney General's office said, by a long-standing convention reflected in the Ministerial Code, whether the law officers have been asked to provide legal advice and the content of any advice is not disclosed outside government without the explicit consent. That consent is rarely given. That's the end of the article. So I think what we need to do now is make sure that we're all behind a real push and effort to get the law changed, because ultimately that's what we need anyway. The law is based on lies. No one fully understands it. We've got self-ID, inexplicably, but we have self-ID. Anyone can just do whatever they like and say that they're the opposite sex and have rights regardless. They don't need a GRC. They don't need to change any legal documentation. Don't need anything. So that's where we're going. And from me, I'm going to pass you over to three lovely, lovely fellas on GB News and their views on this news. Take care, and I'll see you next time.
Moving on, what is on the front cover of the Times, Paul?
Oh, legal fears over gender guidance for schools. So the key salient points here are that this is around social transitioning, Leo. So this is about the idea of people being able to socially, locally, casually transition to any gender they wish to do so.
I'm a woman.
You are, to me. And what's happening here is Sunak essentially is trying to make this unlawful, but he's being told that it would be unlawful to do so, and he'd need to pass his own legislation for him to enact a law that would prevent this from happening. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with someone socially doing anything. The problem comes when they demand that society agrees with them come what may.
And refers to them as a dinosaur,
whatever
or,
it would
or
be.
whatever they identify as.
These are all anecdotal, but they've been proven time and time again. People will say, I just said it's anecdotal, but people will say that this stuff doesn't happen. It clearly does.
Just go on TikTok. Literally go on TikTok, type in cat people or identify as a cat, and loads of videos will come up.
Well, and this is the thing, Josh. I mean, this is at the level of sort of indoctrination. There's been such a huge surge in the number of young people identifying as different genders, not just different genders, but different species and even different forms of matter. You can identify as the moon and things like that. I mean, this is, it's like a cult-like religion.
No, it's a fad. It's a fashion. That's what it is, and it's a fashion.
But unlike fashions in the 80s, when you got a mullet, you could grow a mullet out. If you have your penis removed, or if you have a penis created and your breast removed, that's kind of harder to grow out.
Well, also
or get rid of the double denim.
Yeah, well, exactly.
A permanent mullet.
Yeah, but unlike also the 80s, the teachers are not encouraging students to get the mullet.
Yeah.
And also, if anybody says, "Oh, that mullet looks a bit rubbish," they're not threatening. They're calling them despicable and threatening to kick them out of school.
Yeah.
So what they're trying to do is it's about safeguarding, and also it's about who influences your children.
Yeah.
Do you have the influence on your children? Do you have control over what information that they get and what they have access to, or are the teachers pushing the stuff?
Yeah, because Paul, I mean, that's the terrifying thing, because parents aren't being informed when their children socially transition at school, and that's quite often the pathway to fully transitioning. So I mean, parents who are usually generally the best custodians of their own children, rather than some blue-haired indoctrinated communist primary school teacher. Don't you think it's dangerous for the state to step in between the parents and the children like that?
It's terrifying. It is very dangerous. And what's happening here is, quite often, and I have done, and I know we just did then, is criticise teaching and teaching staff for not standing up against it. In many ways, they have absolutely no idea what to teach. They are completely at a loss. So what happens is they get in third parties who come in, some quango will come in with their bits and bobs hanging out and tassels all over the place and say this all stuff's true. And they do it in a way that's kind of like a nasty person. I'm trying to think of the right word for TV, but like a nasty person would. They will go to the child and say, you shouldn't tell your parent about this.
Which is the language of groomers. This is, I've got some puppies in the van. It's that kind of...
Yeah, it's not like, it just happened to my kids a few weeks ago. The way they do it, they tack it on to a bunch of very viable and real stuff, like tackling homophobia.
And making sure people feel accepted.
Yeah, and all of that stuff. And then they sort of go, and also there are all these genders or identities or sexes that you can identify, and there's pansexual, and all this stuff gets them confused. You have girls in my kids' classes who wear trousers and have short hair and whatnot, tomboys, essentially.
Yeah, they're the teachers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And now suddenly what? And they go, no, you're non-binary because you're... But the problem here legally...
Which is homophobic in itself.
Yeah, well, exactly. Of course, these ridiculous ideas of what gender is...
So, we got to
move, go.
Please like, follow, share, subscribe, all the rest of the YouTubey things. Do take care. Hope to speak to you again soon.